Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Welcome back for another episode of the Networking RX podcast. I'm your host, Frank Agan, founder and president. Today we have a guest on. As many of you know, from time to time I have guests on. Often it's just me talking about concepts related to professional networking, professional relationships. But today I have a guest on. I have a guest who is on the phone from University of Washington, Associate Professor Ryan Fehr with the Foster School of Business at the University of Washington. And he focuses on building more ethical and socially responsible organizations. He teaches ethics courses both in the MBA program and at the undergraduate level, and conducts research on topics such as ethical leadership and workplace gratitude and generally just prosocial behavior. So Ryan, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Well, why don't you give us the nickel tour of you and how you got into this? I know you and I have spoke before. How you got interested in the whole concept of gratitude, and we'll kind of go from there.
Sure. Well, so I was, I guess this journey sort of began when I was in graduate school at the University of Maryland. And I was getting a degree in organizational psychology because I was interested, sort of broadly in making the workplace better, making work more enjoyable and more fulfilling. And so then I was trying to think about, what's sort of the best way to accomplish that? What are sort of some research areas where it seems like there's this potential to have a positive impact? And I kind of settled on this idea of building more positive relationships at work and how we can do that. So some of my early research was on forgiveness as a way of managing conflict and ensuring constructive relationships. And then later on in my career, I started to become interested in gratitude, because whereas forgiveness is kind of what I call a low base rate, high impact phenomenon. It sort of requires conflict. It can be really impactful, but only in certain circumstances. I became really interested in gratitude to the extent that it's something that we can practice every day, and as a result can have a positive impact every day. And as I started talking to organizations about gratitude, I started to see a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of potential. So sort of what I sometimes call the gratitude gap, that sort of separation between what we say we hope work would be like and what it actually is. There's really a big gap as it relates to gratitude. And so in that, I sort of saw a big opportunity for doing research on this topic.
Okay. So essentially, if we have gratitude in the workplace, there's less of a need for forgiveness. I guess that's my observation, but that wasn't necessarily yours. If I heard you, what you're basically saying is to try and understand forgiveness, you really need to find bad things, conflict, as you put it. And that's not necessarily, you don't have to go to that degree to see a lack of gratitude, and the impact of lack of gratitude is essentially really what it.
Sure. Well, a way to think about it is that gratitude can have a positive impact in so many aspects of our work life. So it positively impacts sort of our general outlook. It positively impacts our relationships. And so there's not a lot of research on how gratitude impacts forgiveness, but it's not a stretch to suggest that as you take a more grateful outlook, it becomes easier for you to sort of see other people, including people you're having conflict with, in a more benevolent light. But really what gratitude is doing is it's sort of reorienting the way you see the world around you, and then that's naturally going to sort of, create a lot more constructive interactions. And that, of course, would flow over to things like how you manage conflict.
Okay. Well, with respect to your research, what are some things you're finding relative to gratitude?
Sure. So there's a lot of different ways to think about gratitude. Sometimes I refer to these two different pillars that we have for gratitude as we try to build it in our lives. First, there's an inward pillar, which is about cultivating a grateful outlook. And that's oftentimes what people think about when they think about gratitude, something like gratitude journaling that sort of changes the way you're seeing the world around you. And then the other pillar is the outward pillar, which I call more building a habit of appreciation. And it's that outward pillar that I actually think is underemphasized, and that's the one that I think is more deserving of attention, particularly in organizations. And when I think about that gratitude gap, I think that it's particularly prevalent in organizational settings. So for instance, there is some data from the Greater Good Science Center, which comes out of Berkeley, that showed that only 10% of employees on a given day actually say thank you to their colleagues. And 60% of employees never, very rarely express gratitude at work. And that's interesting because then if you ask them what they think the impact of gratitude can be on their lives, over 90% of people agree it can have this positive impact. And about 70% of employees say they'd leave their job if they didn't feel appreciated. So I think particularly in work, because there's so many interpersonal interactions that happen on an everyday basis, it's gratitude expression and sort of the binding capacity that can have that's likely to have a positive impact.
It's interesting, I mean, it's you talk about these two pillars, and maybe it's intuitive to you, but as I think about them, the inward pillar is really one-to-one. I mean, I can't have an inward impact on the gratitude you have for you, right? I can only have an inward impact on the gratitude I have for myself. Mm-hmm. But the outward pillar, inward is one-to-one, outward is one-to-many. I mean, I can stand before a whole team and say, I really appreciate the effort, and everybody's kind of impacted. So it does. It's much more, I guess what the term would be scalable. So
yes. Yeah. Sometimes we talk about spillover effects and just the idea that, there's something about too, I think that the idea is that as we start expressing gratitude to others, because it's outward, because it's a behavior that people can see, the more we do it, the more it can actually shift the culture of an organization. So gratitude expression is something that's observable and it's external. And the more that people do it in the workplace, the more it creates what you could call a positive spiral that then has sort of this positive self-strengthening impact in organizations.
Gotcha.
I'll give you one example of a research project that I did recently on this. I was interested in the impact of gratitude expression, and so we did a gratitude expression intervention in an organization that makes airline food. So this is, not the most pleasant job in the world. We're talking about people who work on sort of the factory conveyor belt, assembling the food together, people that clean the equipment, people that transport the food to the airport itself every day. And so what we did is we took all the different factories. There were about 6 or 7 factories that produce this airline food in this one city. And we randomly assigned the factories so that the employees would either express gratitude to each other every day for a week, or they'd be in a control condition where they didn't. And what we found is that after 1 week of gratitude expression, following those employees the next 3 weeks after that, the employees ended up being more engaged in their work, and they also engaged in more helping behavior. So more sort of voluntary acts of helping each other at work. The other interesting thing that we found is that those gratitude expressions, sort of the increase when we told them to express gratitude to each other in the first week, they continued to express gratitude above baseline to each other after that week is over. And I think that this points to something really important, which is that, if we ask ourselves, why isn't gratitude more prevalent at work? I think that we sort of have some false beliefs about the appropriateness of gratitude and its likely impact. In fact, there was a study that was done by one of my colleagues at the University of Chicago, where he asked people, how do you think it would go if you express gratitude to somebody? And they said, oh, I don't know. I don't think they'd be particularly surprised. They know that I appreciate them. I don't think it would really enhance their mood in any way. And I think it would actually be pretty awkward. I think it'd be kind of weird and awkward to, just walk up to somebody and tell them that I feel grateful for And then they actually had people do it. And what they found was that people were very surprised, didn't know the ways in which they were appreciated by somebody else. It uplifted those people's moods much more than was anticipated. And it wasn't really awkward at all. And so I think that once we try it out, once we try to develop this habit of gratitude expression, we start seeing the positive impact that it can have. Sort of those fears about it being awkward or us being perceived in some sort of negative way kind of fall to the wayside, and then it quickly becomes something that is self-reinforcing.
And I'm certainly not challenging the results, but how do you guys measure this sort of stuff? Are these questionnaires, people self-reporting, or is there observation there?
So it is primarily self-report. So there are sort of established measures for employee engagement that track people's sense of energy and at work and things like that. And then we have people's helping behaviors that, again, they self-report as well. Now, there is other research outside of organizational settings. It's difficult to track. You can get behavioral measures of something like organizational citizenship behavior. The logistics of what we were doing with the intervention and all didn't allow for that. But there's plenty of experimental evidence in social psychology that rather clearly shows that gratitude increases pro-social behavior that's measured, for instance, in a laboratory context, whether or not you actually help somebody else when given the opportunity. There's also a meta-analysis that was done in one of the best psychology journals. A meta-analysis is where you combine all the research that's been done on a given topic over many years. That showed pretty clearly that whether it's measured as a self-report or behaviorally in the lab or behaviorally in the field, this impact of gratitude on pro-social behavior is pretty well established. Now, what's interesting here is it's not just reciprocal. So it's not just that, you express gratitude to somebody and then they help you back. Rather, gratitude seems to create what we would call more generalized pro-social behavior, which is that this act of gratitude, both for the recipient and the expressor, this is another one of the interesting findings, that this also happens for the expressor, increases our general tendency to be pro-social. And so I think, again, this speaks to sort of the power of gratitude expression. We're impacting the recipient and we're impacting the expressor. But not only within that dyad, because people are helping other people in their networks, if you want to sort of use that phrasing, it sort of spills over, so people are helping each other throughout the organization.
It becomes contagious, more or less,
exactly.
in a good way.
Exactly.
In a good way. Are there any studies out there that will measure hormonal changes, oxytocin, things like that? I mean, I can see where it's hard with the things you're doing. You're not pulling people off the line and saying, "Hey, we need to take blood," or take a saliva swab. But
yeah, we could. Not in the organizational literature. I'm not immediately familiar with anything in sort of more of the biopsychological literature on that. So yeah, I guess that would be something that we could study in the future, but I'm not immediately familiar with anything on that hormonal sort of thing.
Okay. Well, were there any anomalies that you stumbled across in this whole process?
Surprises? Surprises. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting sort of question. I guess it depends on how you define surprise. I usually think of anomalies or surprises as things that are sort of just shifting my understanding of the way I would think that this would act. And so just a couple of the things that I think are surprising. One that's important at work is this question of the way people prefer to receive appreciation. I think that in the workplace, we have this bias where we think of work as very transactional. So I go in, I get a paycheck, I go home, that's my appreciation, and anything else, sort of the non-monetary side of things, is just kind of fluffy and nobody really cares about it. But in fact, if you look at the ways people say that they prefer to receive appreciation at work, monetary signs of appreciation are only the favorite way of being shown appreciation for about 8% of people. And for more than 60%, it's the least favorite way for people to receive appreciation. What they really want are things like quality time with the person who appreciates them, or sort of some act of service, sort of giving back to that individual or to the community. Whereas verbal signs of appreciation, if done right, can be particularly effective. And so that's one thing that you could say is surprising, because again, it kind of counteracts this sort of tendency to think of the workplace as very transactional. One of the other surprises, I think, that I mentioned briefly earlier, is that an expression of gratitude isn't just beneficial for the person that receives it. It's actually beneficial for the person that expresses it. In particular, one of the things that expressing gratitude really does is it strengthens the relationship between the giver and the recipient. So there's something about the act of expressing gratitude that serves this kind of bonding effect between those two people. And it's actually really memorable. One of the strongest interventions in the positive organizational literature is what's called a gratitude letter test, where you write a letter to somebody who's had a meaningful impact on you in your life, and then you actually read it to them.
Interesting.
And yeah, and it's something where you can kind of just imagine how this would go. I mean, it's something that neither of those two people forget for the rest of their life. If somebody walks up to you and says, I just want you to know this big impact that you've had, and I wrote this letter for you, and reads it, it's really something that is going to be remembered by both parties, and because of that has a really lasting effect, even though it's something that you're just doing for a couple minutes.
I have this vision of doing that with my father, who's 86 years old. I'm sure he'd remember it for the rest of his life.
I would strongly encourage you to write that letter today, and it could absolutely have huge impact on both of you.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting exercise. Several years ago, I have 3 kids and a wife, and I bought a journal for each of them, and right at January 1, and every day I wrote something I appreciated about them, day by day, and then December 31st, that following year, I handed them the journal, and that was a labor. I got teenage kids. It's not always easy to,
Sure.
But I remember giving the journal to my kids and my wife, and they still have them. They're pick up. They're not in a case or anything like that, but they have them. But when I gave them to my oldest son, who's really kind of stoic, good kid, but really kind of stoic, he came downstairs and I was sitting there doing something, and he said, "Dad, stand up." I'm like, "Why?" "I got to give you a hug. My girlfriend said if I don't give you a hug, she's coming down here to do it for me." It was pretty funny.
Yeah.
You have any books or programs on the horizon, or you get?
So, as a researcher, I mostly write academic papers that I don't think you'd want to read.
Okay.
Kind of the way it works is we write these academic papers, and then we fold those up into something like a Harvard Business Review paper and write a book down the line. So, a book is on the horizon, but the more distant horizon. So nothing
right.
I could recommend right now. I spend a lot of time outside of academics. I give a lot of workshops on gratitude to lay audiences. So that's kind of the main way that I sort of get this message out there to the public.
Okay. All right. Good enough. What's on the horizon? I remember this quote from high school biology: "As the island of knowledge grows, so does the shoreline of curiosity." And I look where this field of study has come in not that I've been a part of it, but you start and look and see what's been done. But in the last 30 some years, we've always known that we have these warm and fuzzy feelings by doing things, and now we're kind of really getting at what these things mean. But we're finding all these things out. What's next? I mean,
yeah.
What do you if you can share with us, what are things that you're working on, or maybe other people are working on, or what are the hypotheses?
Sure. Well, I guess the project I'm most excited about that I'm working right now is I'm working with Aqua, which is the largest micro-lending organization in Pakistan.
Okay.
And so what we're doing there is, so they give, just for context, they give very small loans out to people in mostly rural communities to help them start businesses, to help them grow businesses, to help them get out of the debt of high interest money lenders, things like that. They've given out nearly $1 billion in microloans to date to people throughout the country.
Now, when you say microloans, are we talking like 500 or 1,000 US dollars, or do you
Much
know?
less. We're talking more like $50 at a time.
Oh my God! Wow. Yeah.
But that can play this huge role
Sure.
in really facilitating success. So they have about 700 branches throughout Pakistan. And just last week, we launched the first wave of a study where we're looking at gratitude expression networks within the branch offices, which are offices about 5 or 6 people. And then we're looking at the spillover effects of that on customers. So what's particularly interesting about the model of this organization is they have this idea that you get the microloan, and then it fundamentally impacts you and how you act within your local community, right? So you have gratitude for this microlending organization, and then you sort of pay that forward through more gratitude and compassion in your local community. And so when we talk about the spillover effects, this is really putting it to the test, looking at how sort of the interactions within the employees and the customers then spill over into those local communities. So this is kind of a really big countrywide, honestly, test of the power of gratitude expression with this organization. So that's, one of the projects I'm most excited about.
Interesting. Okay. Is there any way the listening audience might help or support you?
Well, if anyone would like to discuss bringing gratitude into their organizations, whether through a research project or a workshop, you could feel free to reach out to me. My email address is r.flakenfrankehr@uw.edu. I'm always looking for people to work with on this important topic, and I'd be happy to speak with whoever's interested.
I will put your email address in the show notes. Of course, I would be a total heel if I didn't say, I really appreciate you being on the program.
Of course. Happy to be here. I appreciate you inviting me.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AMSPIRIT.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.